Hello, welcome everybody back to the 706 podcast, the podcast where we, the four film fiends, take a look at a movie and decide whether it's one of the 706 greatest films of all time. I'm your host, Connor, and I have with me my other fiends, my partners in crime. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves, guys? How about Tony?
Hey guys, this is Tony.
Anthony. And the fan favorite, Kirk.
Hello, folks.
Let's pause for the applause there. Okay, thank you, guys.
It's like Kramer entering the apartment over here.
Yeah. It was my pick for this week. I decided to go something a little bit perhaps narcissistically close to home. I'm a grad student currently in a classics department studying sort of ancient texts and things of that nature. I discovered this film, Footnote. It's a film all about the relationship of a father and son. The father is awarded a prize. Turns out it was actually a mistake. The prize was originally supposed to be awarded to the son. These father and son are two scholars of Talmudic literature, something kind of similar, right? Different, obviously, in a different context, but something clearly related to what I personally work on, which is ancient texts and editing them and creating kind of commentary on them. So I became fascinated with the movie for that reason. Just to go into just the plot, I basically explained the main premise there, but it's kind of about how their relationship sort of evolves and moves back and forth as the son discovers, right, that there was a mistake, that the prize is supposed to be awarded to him and not to his father, and he tries to set things right. Ultimately, it turns out that his father then also publishes a really mean article about him, basically, right? There's a huge distinction between these two, this father and son, right? The father, Eliezer, is a really old school philologist who's all about details and very rigorous textual interpretation. The son, on the other hand, Eliezer, is more of a kind of modern popularizer, someone who's really charismatic and has a kind of following, and kind of in the wider public. And the movie, I think, is kind of about, the battle of these two styles of academic work, which is really kind of at the heart of, for instance, my discipline, this conflict. And so I find it really interesting for that reason, but enough about me, guys. I'm curious to hear what you felt about the movie.
Well, unlike Connor, who does classics, I'm an actual Talmudic scholar. I don't know if you guys know, but I'm at the University of Jerusalem, and I'm a PhD candidate, and I've just been pitching this movie forever, and Connor will not pick it. I think it's narcissism of small differences, honestly. Like, he's like, classics, that's the real stuff. The Talmud, what's that? And I'm just like, well, yeah. Anyway, we've had these arguments many times. You've listened to the bonus bits on the Night Moves episode. You'll hear a lengthy half-hour good-hearted difference of opinion. But
sort of a Talmudic scholar, Tony, but...
Well, that's debatable. But so this movie, I enjoyed it quite a bit, actually. I've definitely had I'm not in academia. I'm in law school. I'm not a PhD candidate or anything. I've done a lot of this scholarly work in the legal field, but I have a tremendous amount of fascination and respect for that world and that community, or the idea of being a person who's just preserving knowledge and passing it on. I think is a very cool thing, and the idea of dedicating yourself to becoming an expert in one thing is something I've always been that's really interesting. It's not a thing I necessarily would do, but I think it's really interesting and cool. So the movie definitely I have an interest in its general world, not the Talmud per se, but that environment and kind of the politics of it and the dynamics of it. And I thought that this movie they brought this subject to life in a really fun way. I thought that the editing and the music, it was very brisk. It was very kind of it was never over the top, but it was fun. It was they made some interesting choices with they show a map and they show the sun earlier. So they show Uriel popping up on a map, and this little animation of him giving a little speech and just extemporaneously just laying knowledge on people around town and just stuff like that. I was oh, that's really fun, because this could have been a very in the hands of a different director, perhaps it would have been a very dry kind of simple depiction of this kind of story. And at the heart, it is a very simple story, but I thought that the central dynamic between the father and son was very strong. It was complicated. It wasn't a thing of like, you had the passed over father and the son who's taking up all his glory. It's not a one-dimensional thing. I mean, that's kind of at the heart of it, but there's a lot other things going on where the son in a way is jealous of his father too, because there's ways in which he feels maybe he's inadequate compared to him. I really loved that scene where Uriel's talking to his wife, and his wife says in kind of a brutal, casually brutal way, like, well, yeah, I know you'd never cheat on me because you're a coward. It's not because you're like a man necessarily. You're just too much of a wuss to ever do something like that. And it's just like, oh my God. It's just like, that's a brutal thing to say. And just like this movie has a number of scenes of that kind of a casual brutality where it's kind of laid out on the table. But I loved, and I wish I knew, Connor, what's the name of the actor who played Uriel?
The son.
Yeah,
That's
son.
Lior Ashkenazi is his name.
Yeah, he was, I thought he was amazing. I thought he was phenomenal. I thought that was such a nuanced, sensitive performance. I think he really brought you into that character, and he portrayed him in a way where you could definitely understand the father. You could definitely see how someone could find this guy a little bit obnoxious, but at the same time, there was just such a humanity and just like his anger and his sadness, and he just wanting to connect with his father, but still kind of pushing him away. And then the way he pushes his son away, and another very brutal scene. So I enjoyed this movie a lot. And I also think, and we can talk more about it later, but I also thought it articulated like a pretty cool idea about academia, or about what the purpose is of learning and knowledge. And yeah, even though I'm not interested in this field. So anyway, I definitely enjoyed it.
Maybe Anthony, do you want to weigh in? What was your feeling? You're a bit of an academic yourself.
Yeah, I say we let Kurt go first.
Kurt?
if he's okay.
Oh man,
I don't know what that means. What Anthony has up his sleeve.
you don't mind. You can.
He's polishing a gem right now. He's going to show us, and I'm not
my
ready.
Talmudic manuscript.
Anthony wants to steal the Israel prize from me for the 6th year in a row. Unbelievable. No, so let me just start by saying last week I hastily, heuristically compared this movie based on what I'd heard of it to A Serious Man. And I think that was, in hindsight, I was kind of thinking more and more about that. The reason I was doing that is because I was expecting a lot of kind of pontificating about God's will and the fallibility of man. And we didn't really get that. It was almost an inversion of A Serious Man, where in A Serious Man, you have a physicist who kind of understands the rules of nature. He fails in his family life, of course. This is very broad theorizing here, and just bear with me. But he misses the mark when it comes to the spiritual, existential nature or purpose of life. And in this movie, we have people who deal with, I guess it's a scientific paradigm in a way, but they're dealing with religious texts, right? Like ultimately the Talmud is a religious text that includes, it has various aspects, of course. It has, musings about purity and about marital relations and all these things. But so I guess for me, this movie kind of showed that these people, ironically, they're so engaged with this, this kind of aspect that they're engaged with the idea of how to be in the world, right? How to be a good person, in a good Jew, essentially. And yet they miss the mark on how to be a good family member. Like, it's like they almost don't take or heed the lessons that they're exposed to, right? So I think that's interesting. It's kind of an interesting inversion. And that's a trope that's played out in a lot of movies, kind of where it's like an expert trap, right? Where people, they have this one crucial blind spot that ultimately ends up being kind of their downfall. But I liked this movie. I thought it was really interesting. And I thought it was ultimately, there really wasn't much to do with, pontificating. A Serious Man is more of a religious movie to me. This is very, like, even though it takes place in what we would consider to be like a highly religious atmosphere, right? Like Israel, right? You know, as opposed to America, like the secularization of America, right? It felt like more of a secular movie, more of a kind of grounded movie than A Serious Man. And I thought it was also more accessible. But anyways, that's enough of the comparisons. I think this movie ultimately, like Tony said, is about relationships, like how we kind of pass on intergenerational dynamics of interaction and how those are passed on either explicitly or tacitly throughout the family life cycle. And so in that sense, from as a social worker, it's very interesting to kind of study that and understand that and see it. And so, you know, you look at it from that perspective and you understand that Uriel is just trying to appease, trying to placate his father throughout the movie, throughout his life, right? And at the same time, at the end, he's unknowingly kind of reanimating these modes of interaction with his own son. You know, the idea of like traditional, focused on external successes, not focused on emotional processing, not focused on catharsis or expression, right? More focused on providing success, security. And I think he kind of has to deal with his father's like rigid traditionalism, and he's trying to break free of that. But then he kind of is rubber banded back towards it at the end, to like in spite of his father, which is quite interesting. But I think at the end, the ultimate understanding is seeing that he doesn't have to be his father. At the end, you know, at the prize ceremony, we see him kind of subtly make amends with his wife, and we assume, I guess maybe I assume, that he's going to take a different path than his father's taken, where his father kind of sold out his family for this vain pursuit of something that was false to begin with. You know, this, like he says, like to the other professor, his father's contemporary, he says, "You don't seek truth. You're a man, you're immortal, you seek honor." And I think that was one of the most interesting parts of the movie for me. It's like, yeah, there's I don't have much exposure to academia, but there is like this idea of like, at least that was presented in the movie, is that like this truth is this kind of unassailable, immutable object that we're all trying to pursue, whereas it might be a little more contextual and it might be a little muddier. And you know, I think it was well written. I'm just speaking like mechanically. I think it was well written. There was a scene where it was just kind of very confusing. It was almost out of like an ABC Family movie, where they were like, okay, we need the son to somehow see his father, but we need him to be anonymous. So let's have him lose his clothes and then go find like fencing equipment and
That was pretty awkward.
look around the corner. That was one of the strangest moments. That was straight out of Book of Henry. Like that was so poorly executed.
I agree.
That was one of the weirdest fucking moments. Maybe they thought they needed more like lightheartedness, or I don't know what they thought they needed.
You guys just aren't in academia. That happens all the time.
Wait, so if I see
you
a
don't know
guy in a
about this
fencing
tradition?
outfit, should I assume he's an undercover academic?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
It's
that
a
was
classic rite of passage to lose
So you have to
your
see your
clothes at the health
father
club.
talk to somebody in the outfit. That's the ultimate.
Also, this movie had like, I want to say roughly a dozen production credits, kind of splashes at the beginning. I think this may have been the movie that had the most of any movie I've ever seen. There were probably 12 to 15, which is kind of, that's annoying, but you can
They
tell
lost
that,
half a star from Kirk for that.
yeah, you can tell that
production credits.
I'm really nitpicking here, but it was an interesting kind of look into Israeli
Citation, right?
Is doubly interesting because they're in such an esteemed profession that felt so hierarchical and so established, that we were able to look at a culture and look at kind of the occupation within the culture and how it might have been morphed and how it's influenced by its position within that culture. So I really enjoyed it. I think it was definitely worth seeing. So good stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Kirk. I just to butt in for just 1 second before Anthony goes, just about, yeah, I mean, our director, Joseph Cedar, is an Orthodox Jew who lives in Israel. He's of American extraction. Actually, he went to NYU. Yeah, it's funny how the Talmud almost never comes up. It only comes up, I think, twice, like in terms of its moral interpretation in the movie. And one of them is like, it's Eliezer basically saying, like, listen, things aren't so nice in real life. You know, it's just this completely cynical attitude about it. They don't really follow it. But anyway, sorry, Anthony, go ahead.
No, that was interesting, but I thought Kirk's opinion was gonna, rotate like 3 or 4 times in that introduction. So
I thought there was gonna be a butt. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, you threw a lot of things I hadn't even thought about, but I think for me the interesting part is I think it's a pretty good movie. I think the interesting thing is, Kirk and Tony were talking so much about the son, but the dad, of how like they create him and how, and at least to my eyes, how sympathetic his caricature really is, and that he's someone who's establishing this like work on this sort of minute little thing, sort of the traditional romantic idea of academic work, right? Which is like these sort of small little research questions you have, these small little items you really want to do, may be answered, and they may have really big implications once they're out in the world. But they also at the same time might not be appreciated by the public. There's a sort of sense of like you want to have your ideas be as expansive as possible while at the same time being as interesting and controlling to a small little group as possible, versus the sort of more modern conception of like the popular academic, the intellectual who writes things that the popular culture might be interested in, the stuff that he calls the sort of empty vessel of the pot or whatever, the pottery barn, right? And I think that's a kind of an interesting interplay that goes throughout. And like Kirk says, I mean, on one hand, the movie wants to say is it doesn't matter because they're missing the very central question of the text itself, which is just how to be a good person, how to be a good family member, that these sort of things are all kind of invented for the sake of a profession that only wants to honor itself. I think that's all very interesting. In its own way, it's become like the most realistic movie I've ever seen about academic life, maybe besides Wonder Boys. So I think there's a lot of interesting things going on. I do think at times the sort of scenes like that fencing thing feel almost out of place to the larger questions and moral questions at hand. Sometimes I kind of wish those were centered, but I thought the choices that were made, like just leaving on the dad in that opening part as the son's receiving his award, was so good. Like I got all like the sort of annoyances of the dad at the same time, the sort of cringiness of that award ceremony, this inherent idea that prizes should be worth anything at all anyway, is also underlying the movie. So I thought all that was pretty interesting. And I thought overall it was a pretty solid movie with like a lot of things to play with from both people who are familiar with kind of academic culture and those not, as evidenced by Tony and Kirk.
I just want to say that opening scene, it was very interesting and subverting expectations in the beginning. I didn't really remember the description too much, but I thought the father was the one being awarded all these honors. And then his son stands up. That was such a perfect moment. I could really empathize with the father in that moment. And, those kind of fleeting feelings of resentment that are instilled in the viewer are really great. And, they're kind of, the totem for that is his father's contemporary, I forget the name, kind of the
Grossman is his name.
Yeah, he's well done as well. I think the best scene in the movie is when Uriel is told that there's been a mistake and he actually won the prize in that small little room.
In this really cramped, this depressing little room. Yeah.
They're all
this is someone's office that they've adapted for the purpose, but I love it because
gag, like whenever someone goes in or out, they all have to get up because the chair is against the door.
Yeah, they're awkwardly stuck together. They're kind of bumping shoulders.
And the first time it happens, it's like just kind of like, oh yeah, but then like the fourth time it gets very funny. So anyway, go ahead.
You're really stuck with it, yeah. But just to comment on that, I mean, just the fact that they're in this, I mean, it's a very memorable scene, this being in this cramped office, but I love it because it tells you so much about, right, this is the Ministry of Education, and this is sort of all the resources they have devoted to this topic of education. In reality, right, they're all just in this cramped little room. Whereas, right, when it suits them, right, the Israeli government will put on a huge pageant, this huge, awesome stage, this like arena, to give people awards, for these cultural pursuits, but in reality, it's this very depressing, sort of barely there sort of infrastructure to support it, Anyway, I'm sorry, Kirk, you weren't finished commenting on it.
No, I just thought it was. I'm ambivalent about whether or not we were kind of given the reason that. Grossman. The reason
Grossman, who's the rival.
The reason
the gross
he
man
despised his father, like
it was
he wanted that as some kind of a little bit of. To counterbalance the feelings of kind of disgust that I felt towards the father, especially towards the end. And if we were to find out that he was like, he was being unfairly maligned by his contemporaries, I think that would have been quite a good antidote to some of the kind of disgusting things that came about with regards to the article that really just towards the end, at least for me, I had no real sympathy for the father. I thought he kind of made his bed, and at the end, I think he did kind of realize that he had sold out his family for this. He found out that his son had forfeited the award for his sake, and he was on stage, and he realized it was all a facade. Like the prize in and of itself was an empty vessel. All the accoutrements were like just glitzy nothingness, the drumming and the banal practicing of shaking hands, and he didn't really understand that until he was in that position. So I thought it was really cool.
I liked especially that, like, we never actually see him shake the president's hand. We see him shake hands with an empty chair. And that's what we see rather than the actual ceremony. It's just like, for him, that's like, this is it. It's an empty chair. It's an empty award. It's all empty.
Yeah. Echoes of Clint Eastwood at the RNC with Obama in the chair, right? But do you remember that? But
yes.
No, but Kirk, I mean, don't you remember that there's two parts I wonder if you caught on, or maybe they didn't work for you, about the father and feeling sympathetic towards him, right? Is we hear a couple moments. One is in that meeting room where we hear that Grossman may have like kind of this hatred for his dad because that famous scholar that the dad was in a footnote in chose him to be in the footnote and not Grossman. So that was one line of resentment. And then the second one, didn't you feel a little bit bad for him that he worked for like 30 years devoted to this sort of minute little topic? And then in comes the scholar who kind of disliked him anyway, could have given him the manuscript knowing he worked for 30 years on this topic that could prove his thesis in a much shorter time. He undercuts him and publishes it himself. So 30 years are out the window. And it doesn't erase, the fact that to devote himself to this topic, he has to kind of neglect his wife and son. But I mean, it is still a little like saddening, at least to me.
Oh, totally. It's sad. It's tragic, right?
Yeah.
Like it definitely is. And I think it's infuriating in a way. You're like, wow, he really didn't get his due. But to me, I guess as a social worker, it all comes down to relationships. And I felt like his son was just being neglected emotionally by his father in a sense, it seemed to be a pervasive theme in their relationship, and his son didn't seem to have done enough. It didn't seem to have caused enough of that reaction. It didn't seem warranted. But I think that just is a generational thing, really, because the father really reminded me of my grandfather, actually, and just kind of how they functioned, how they thought. And I think this is really a story of generations too. But I'll let somebody else go too.
I think both characters, right, are fundamentally unlikable, which I think is a danger. And as I was watching, I'm like, it's worried you guys might not like it because fundamentally the characters are unlikable. And I read some reviews, that kind of said as much, and that fundamentally hurts the movie. Everyone is kind of so cruel and mean, including, right, we think the son is going to be a much, more generous person. Turns out he's not. I mean, he kind of replicates the same, attitude of his father towards his son. And, and he's also kind of a vain and kind of pathetic guy anyway. So everyone is kind of pathetic and miserable. But I think, there's something, in spite of that, I do end up having there's this real pathos to the character. I mean, I think just too, the way he explains, I mean, for me, the father's greatest moment, and this is, again, kind of personal, but when he gives his little speech about the potsherds, which he explains, I don't know what it is in Hebrew, but he says potsherds, broken pottery, right? Which again, just speaks to me, this is kind of classics, lingo too, right? But this idea of, on the one hand, he represents his own style of, of scholarship, that as the father does. This true philological scholarship is carefully dusting off the potsherds and cataloging them by origin, place, style, right? Whereas there's someone else comes along and just makes a pot out of these potsherds, right? Without first cataloging. They've created something that's nice to look at, but isn't really real. And Anthony already mentioned that. That's the idea of the empty vessel, right? The empty vessel of scholarship that is purely kind of, it speaks to our human need for meaning, but it lacks that kind of rigor, that kind of truth, so to speak, right, that a really rigorous, really dry kind of scholarship ultimately does accomplish. And I think in that moment you get, the beauty of what he does, and why he does it that way, and why, and on some level, I think the movie ultimately says that too is just a kind of ambition, just a kind of selfish attitude, right? It's also a search for popularity. It's just a less successful search for popularity, but that always just sticks out to me, and I think it's a really standout movie, one of my favorite moments in the movie.
Tony, I'm curious what you said you were going to say for later, kind of touching on scholarship or learning, theory of learning. What were you referencing?
Oh, no. Well, I think that the opening of the movie, it's brilliant, as you pointed out, for that little quick subversion of your expectations where the son stands up and not the father, and we just hang on the father, and we just see he just looks deflated. He just looks bad. Because every time he hears his own name, why am I not remembering the names at all? Professor
Skolnick.
Sorry. Professor Skolnick is like a mocking tone in his ears, because it's like he knows it's not him, right? But the other thing that's brilliant about it is the speech by the son, because the movie kind of takes it on this 360-degree journey. Because it started off with this nice, sincere moment, and we might expect the father to look proudly at his son and shed a tear and clap. And of course we don't get that. And then we get the scene where the son's talking to his wife and basically saying yeah, it was all bullshit. The way it actually happened, he grabbed my hand, and it's a far less wholesome, nice memory than he described it on stage. Yeah. And then they kind of bring it back at the end of the movie. And what's great about that is it's a scene that's it's undercut, and we're kind of told it's bullshit, right? But at the same time, it reflects something that's, I think, kind of true. Anyone who, at least it should be true, we should want it to be true, that, this pursuit is about teaching at the end of the day. And his work is no less valid or no less important because this other guy found the book first and he got the big trophy. That shouldn't matter at all. If he's a truly committed person to this project, and he really means what he says about cataloging the potsherds, then he shouldn't be upset about it. I mean, it's understandable as a human being he's upset, wanting that glory. And I think that it generalizes out, though, this idea of there being our stated reasons for doing things and the philosophical purpose of it, and then how that thing actually works in reality. Ideally, academia should be this noble cast of these monks who are devoted selflessly to the propagation of knowledge in a given field. Mm-hmm. When we know in reality, a lot of those people have an ego driving them to do it. And you want the glory, you want the bright publication, you want the medal from the president or whomever. And that's just human nature. It doesn't make them bad people, but it's in any field, in any pursuit, you have that. And I had this in film school, I would have that too, of what is good for the art, what furthers art, and what makes me feel good, what flatters my ego, what'll make other people look at me and think I'm a good person. And I think there's no escaping that in life, is that tension. And I think the movie, in a way, argues for this kind of Zen, no, it should just be about the knowledge. It shouldn't be about the award. It should be about your family, and it should be about living by these values. And I think the fact that it's the Talmud too kind of brilliantly cues us to think about this, because as Kirk points out, it's a religious text, and you're thinking, well, these people aren't really talking about the substance of it. They're not talking about the actual lessons it espouses. But then it's also like, even if you don't care about that, and you only care about it as like a scholarly pursuit, and you don't believe in the Talmud, they're not even seriously pursuing that. And I think this is reflected in like all the characters, and Grossman as well. The son points out that he's a hypocrite, and he's only doing these things for petty reasons, and he would have ordered his father long ago. So I found that like a very relatable idea, and one that kind of implicates all of us. I don't think anyone's kind of left off the hook from that challenge. This movie basically challenges us to live by our stated values. It says, you think you're a teacher, be a teacher. Forget the award, forget your pride, and do the thing you claim you love to do. And I think that's a really universal and important message.
Yeah, I mean, but I would almost say, isn't the movie even more skeptical of even that ability to pursue truth? I'd say, it might even say, this is being polemical, though I think it raises the idea that there might be truth out there to seek, that maybe that the truth, it's almost, that's a vain goal, or that's also just part of kind of an ambitious need to satisfy the ego in a way. But I think too about, just the fact that, again, there's this kind of tragic irony, that in the father's absolute pursuit of truth, that he has this kind of negative consequence, right? He spent all his life really chasing down, right, leads, scrutinizing every single word. And that's exactly the same skill set that leads to him finding out, right, that he didn't actually ever receive his award, right? He could have lived in blissful ignorance, right, and have been happy had he not known, right? And he not tracked down, right, the individual, because the idea is, sorry to explain the plot point from the film, the idea is that Uriel, in order to allow his dad to get the award without revealing that it was really him who was supposed to receive it, he has to write all of the judges' opinions on his father, saying that he should get the award. Now, right, once Eliezer scrutinizes those, he finds that this, and I love this the idea that there's this one word that Uriel abuses in all of his writings, this little phrase that he loves, saying something is a fortress of scholarship, and by doing that, right, then he finds out, right, then all really is for naught, and no one is happy, right? I think there's something, it's expressing a certain kind of skepticism about that. I guess that would be the idea of being the, right, I mean, there's the great moment where Eliezer, kind of in a dream sequence, he stands up imagining, right, he told him that his father was a teacher, that Uriel wrote on his sheet for like a school presentation or something, my dad is a teacher, right? The idea being that teaching would be the most important thing, right? Just pure passing on knowledge, right, is the most important thing. But I think that's contrasted with what Eliezer thinks he is, which is, he says, I'm not a teacher, I'm a philologist. Mm-hmm. Philologist being the idea of you're not a teacher. You're not interested in passing on things, teaching kind of lessons, imbuing people with culture. You're really obsessed purely with a pure kind of scholarly knowledge, right, that is supposed to accumulate over time, is supposed to be indelible and completely and never dies, right, as opposed to teaching, which is kind of just a purely intergenerational kind of gig and is so culturally based and is not indelible and is very much just in this world, right? I think the movie kind of makes a contrast, and ultimately it comes down kind of on the side of the teacher, right? But at the same time, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm going a bit too far, but
no, that's actually how I was like reading it, because I love that philology moment. But to get back to like that opening scene real quick too, is I love that part because the more the movie goes on, the more you realize how much is set up in that opening moment. Like there's that part with Grossman where he's like pointing out to the guard that this is a guy who's familiar to him, and it's not until we recognize that Grossman basically is the reason the father is so undercut in the academy and so like diminished as a role of a researcher and professor. That moment becomes all the more brutal, I think, when you think about it. Like, of course, the guy who stole his token, also has to be the guy who recognizes him, not just his son, but, this colleague. But yeah, that moment of philology is interesting to me. And then the moment too at the end where it seems like what the movie, for me at least, was getting at is somewhere in between the way Connor was talking about it and the way Tony's talking about it. Is that on one hand, the movie does seem to say and suggest that teaching should be a sort of central pursuit here at the end of the day, teaching whether it's to the next generation, teaching future knowledge, teaching, things that could be uncovered by later generations. But I also find it interesting that the movie only has 2 scenes with real teaching going on. Well, a couple really, but one really in the classroom, and then a few in the office hours with these funny phrases that undercut the students, because it's all about the professor's ego and mindset at that moment.
Yeah.
And then there's the other side of the professor himself, which or the father is the fact is like Tony was also saying, is it's interesting that someone who has the value of the award was like a sham. It's proof that our culture of academic work has like fallen to the wayside to promote these kind of flimsy, trendy ideas. The moment I get it, the moment the father gets it, he somewhat embraces it, somewhat hesitantly. But the fact is, once he embraces it, he thinks of himself as harboring possibly this new direction of getting back to what he thinks academic work is. And for him, I think it's like what Connor was saying, it's sort of this romantic idea of just research, right? That is ultimately what he wants, is just to sit in that room. I mean, the fact is, when his wife finally comes in to sleep next to him after, a long time, it seems that they've been apart, there's not a real sense of happiness in that moment.
He knows how many years, yeah.
Yeah, all he is, he's happy to be, or he's most happy to be alone with his kind of books and archive with these silent headphones on and blocking the world. And that's what it really is the world doesn't matter. It's just the research for him.
Well said, everybody. Do we want to vote?
Yeah. No, sorry. I think it's about time to vote, so we can definitely go ahead.
Well, I'll jump in. I'll throw my hat in the ring.
Sure.
I'll say that this is definitely worthy of being in our canon. It's a great movie, and I would say that this movie is very interesting in that there's something off the screen that's appealing to me, and that's learning about kind of the culture and the kind of I want to learn more. We hear little sidebars or I guess it's kind of conversations among academics about stuff like the emasculation of the Jewish male, and that's just something I don't know anything about really. So it's kind of interesting to me to like there's so much in this movie that I'd like to explore and like to learn more about, and I feel like if I were
we'll talk about that after the pod.
Kirk, you and I both know all about the emasculation of the Jewish male. I think we'll leave it at that.
Well, you know what I mean, like I feel there are probably a lot of kind of allusions to the Talmud in this movie that we don't really understand how, at least I don't, not being well versed in its contents. And so, and then ultimately the cultural aspects of it, so what I'm saying is basically if I were an Israeli national, right, and I were invested and well versed in academia, I would probably get a lot more from this movie. But just being a layman, an American with not much knowledge, not much in terms of references, in terms of hermeneutical baggage, I can't really pull that much. I can't really suck that much from the stone, but what I can is very enjoyable. So I think that's kind of almost tantalizing and makes me want to see more almost of this world. But I'd give it a yes. So
yeah, I want
a real place, Kirk. You can go there.
Wait, is it real?
Yeah.
Wait,
Israel.
You didn't hear about this? 1948. There's a whole thing. Anyway.
No, what I loved about that scene, I love that scene as well, because I thought it was another great moment of empathy for the father, because that discussion, you hear this really electric, really passionate discussion about these issues and all these people, and the dad's just like, ugh. He can't be bothered, because you would hope that regardless of your particular calling and your approach to scholarship or whatever, you would still want to engage in those kind of living discussions, or at the very least, even if that's not his field, he should have an opinion about it. He should be interested in it. And it's just he just can't even be bothered. He's just not in a place to do that. And it's maybe that part of him is dead. And that's kind of the scariest thing of all in this movie. The idea that passion, that electricity can die in you with maybe even just with age, not even necessarily with bad experiences. I mean, the scene reminded me of, being at a party for film lovers, and they're saying things like, have you seen the latest Marvel movie? And I'm like, I watch real cinema. I watch Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League, Joker, The Dark Knight Rises. This is real cinema, and no one appreciates it. And for that reason, I'm a yes on Footnote.
Cool.
This is in that canon of real cinema with the Snyder Cut right next to it.
Cool. Well, I'm going to say yes, and as I continue to study the Talmudic influences and Breath of the Wild, I'm going to return to this movie often. So.
Damn, Anthony, don't. That was my idea. How dare you? Okay, great. Well, guys, we've got a really good conversation. The time just flew by. There's more stuff I'd love to talk about, but I guess that's it for Footnote. I'm glad you guys liked it. It gets the Israel Prize. Actually, it's better than the Israel Prize, the 706. Anyway,
this is a real. You would shake the actual president's hand if you won this.
Yeah. So, guys, let's move to the next segment of the podcast where you suggest movies, and I have to pick which one we'll watch for next week.
All right, I've gone least recently.
Sure. So, what do you choose, Kirk? You want to go last?
Yes, Anthony goes first because
Okay.
Tony always has to go first, so I'm giving him a little bit of a break.
Sure.
Okay. All right, Connor. I think it's time we got to go back a few decades here, and we got to get Kirk on the side of film noir again. So I'm going to introduce a movie from the 50s. It's one of the great film noirs, at least to me. It's one of my favorites. It sort of introduces realism, introduces extreme pessimism with this sort of great, surreal, gritty drama in a way that's naturalistic, that I think Kirk would respond to differently than he did from Double. I love the silent laugh I could see from Double Indemnity. But
what are you singing, eh? Putting in a bundle?
Yeah, nominating 1955's "Kiss Me Deadly."
Cool. Very interesting. Okay, Tony.
Okay, so I'm going to go with a Bong Joon-ho film, and I wasn't sure which one I was going to do, but I think I'm going to go with his movie Mother, not related to the Jennifer Lawrence Mother. Yeah, it's basically a story about a relationship between a mother and her son who is accused of a horrible crime. And in Bong Joon-ho fashion, it's a movie there's darkness to it, but it's also very funny. It's a very deft tonal balancing act. If you've seen Parasite, which was his big breakout hit, it's got kind of that same tonal balance where it goes very dark and very light and kind of a moment's notice. But it's a really interesting movie. I remember seeing it being like, wow, this is so interesting. And just this plot and the way it develops. And I was thoroughly entertained by it. So I think it'd be a good pick.
Sure. And Kirk.
All right. I was going to pitch a movie that I don't know is appropriate to follow Footnote. Oh, man. I guess it could be appropriate. Why not?
Guys, we're just
bleeding. If you'd said nothing, I wouldn't have noticed.
No, I think it's good that I preface it, because if it is anti-Semitic, then it's like I knew it, and I can be like, aha.
Sure.
No. How about? Oh man, please don't react.
Like a Holocaust movie? Is that what
Triumph of the Will or
Downfall?
Oh,
Downfall. Okay. Well. That's
quite an intro,
guys. It's not. It's he dies. All right, Hitler dies. It's not like we don't celebrate Hitler in this movie. No, I think it would be quite interesting. Connor and I have talked a little bit about this, but I really want to hear Connor's kind of understanding of this. This movie and the German, have we done a German film? I don't think we have.
Sure.
Have we? I've suggested one or two.
We've nominated a few, yeah.
Yeah. So, I want to be in that headspace, right? But also I think this is just an excellent character study. Obviously a despicable person whose reputation we bring into the movie, and then we see kind of the true madness at play, and we see all the kind of sycophants scuttling under the floorboards, and it's really interesting and thematic and kind of terrifying because we're presented with a perspective of a typewriter who is kind of very naive, but she suddenly starts to realize, what kind of cult she's bought into, and I think it's a great film, and I'd love to talk about it. So, anyways.
Kirk, the one thing for your rebuttals, the one thing is I'm worried, right, about watching the famous scene and having all of the years of memes of Hitler speech memes suddenly
is he going to talk about the PS5 or something? Or?
That's not ein Befehl.
So I'm curious, if I could even watch it straight face. But okay, guys, let's hear some rebuttals.
All right, I got a rebut here. I mean, just to Kirk, honestly. All right, I'm well known in these circles for my critical philosophy that depiction always equals endorsement. And just the prospect of some young incel watching Downfall and getting some ideas makes me not want to even give it the air. We got to boycott Downfall.
Our fans are mostly incels. They're very vulnerable to this.
I know,
kind of thing. We have to keep that in mind.
As we all know, if you see something happen in a movie, you will immediately do it in real life. So that's why I would say no. My movie has no such unwholesome content. It's for the whole family. Watch it with your kids.
Watch with your mother. Yeah.
Exactly. If you are a mother or you have a mother, you're going to love it.
Sure. Anthony?
All right. It's an interesting argument. So I got to say, for my movie, it's a fascinating take of, I won't talk about the plot at all because it already gives too much away, but it's the movie where we're going to see a clear line of influence from all the way to, I don't know, Pulp Fiction, especially David Fincher's like Seven, and especially David Lynch. Like, this is the movie that they ape left and right as Kirk sticks out his tongue in anger and fury. But I think this is the one that Kirk would actually be interested in, of almost all the film noir from that time I could think of. It really does do a lot. I think it's a fascinating movie. I think Tony would have some really curious opinions about it. As for Tony's film, I've never really responded to the Bong. What's his fan base called? Like the Bong Hive? I don't know. Whatever. I never responded like those
bongers.
His eager fans. I've liked Memories of Murder, and that's about it. But everything else I've seen, and I haven't seen Mother, has kind of left me, like I feel like I've missed something, and it doesn't work for me. So maybe that's an interesting, reason to watch it. Maybe this would be the one.
I can't promise that you'd like it, but I think there's a lot of stuff to grab onto. Like, it's very discussable. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Right. Well, there's nothing better than someone promising that I won't like it or might not like it. So, I've heard Kirk talk about this movie since we lived in Jiho. So that'd be my curiosity for that.
You guys, I will just say, you guys pull these movies out of your ass. I don't fucking know where you find it. Divas of Darkness. What's your movie called, Anthony?
Kiss Me Deadly. Come on, Kirk.
I'm working with a smaller. I have a smaller cabinet of films to choose from, but I am very passionate about the ones I have. Anyways, I'm sure I'll enjoy Anthony's movie as long as it's not too there's not too many stupid affectations from that era of film noir. But and then Tony's, I was fan of Parasite and Snowpiercer, so I'm sure I haven't heard anything bad about it, so I'm sure it's a good movie. But yeah, I think ultimately we could also talk about another topic we could talk about when we discuss Downfall is how a nation responds to its own transgressions, right? And whether or not it hides them away, pushes them away, coats them in euphemism, or whether it confronts them in their bloody, uniqueness and truth. And that could be a good one. So anyway, I think the other two are good choices as well. I'll be fair. So
guys, I had a really chilling thought. Can you imagine if America had done anything wrong in its past? Like, wouldn't that be awful? Like, thank God. Just thank God we don't have that.
That's kind of cool. That's a cool idea for like a short story or something.
Yeah.
Like, what if like America was like a genocide place or something? Yeah. Yeah, interesting. That's a spooky idea. That's a good Halloween idea, Tony. Okay, so guys, this is a really tough batch for me. These are all really, really strong picks. I'm really tempted by all of them. I'm most tempted by Anthony's movie and Kirk's movie. Okay, Anthony on the one hand, Kiss Me Deadly has been on my list for a long time. Okay, to save Tony's movie, I just haven't really heard anything about it. I know Bong Joon-ho. I really like Parasite. Don't like a lot of his other movies. I'm fascinated by him, but I'm not the urgency to pick the movie. So I'm sorry. But as for Kiss Me Deadly and Downfall, well, Kiss Me Deadly has been on my list for a long time. It's something that I'm ashamed I haven't seen yet. You know, I love that noir. You know, I respect. I've heard of its influence. On the other hand, Downfall, it's one that I haven't seen in a long time. Would love to revisit, especially after all the memes. Of course, it's German. That's big bonus points for Kirk, right? Hard to decide, guys, but I'm going to go with Der Untergang, Downfall, by Kirk. Of course, I mainly picked it just so I could speak German. So
Vielen Dank.
But I think hopefully it may or may not be a kind of a timely film, and I think to watch.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for all your suggestions. That was a really tough choice. We're going to be seeing Downfall next time. Looking forward to doing it with you all on the next episode of the 706 podcast.
I'll have what she's having.